than we want to admit. We're going to talk about the Vikings salary cap health and how it impacts the future of the team. I got jumbled up right there. What a time to be live on YouTube right now here with you folks. Welcome to a salary cap episode of the Real Forno Show.
And the button isn't working. Welcome to the Real Forno Show, hosted by Tyler Forness, publisher at The Sporting News, contributor on SKOL North's Purple Daily, publisher of Substack Run In Shooter, the host of The Good, The Bad, and The Hungry on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network, and a founding member of Vikings First and SKOL.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Real Forno Show. I'm your host, Tyler Forness. With me, as always, in the top right corner, he's producer Dave, and we're going to talk about the salary cap today. And one of the important things about the salary cap is you have to stay under it, but you also have to spend at least 89% of it over a rolling 5-year period. Why? Maintain competitive balance in the National Football League, something Major League Baseball could learn a thing or two about, but that's neither here nor there. Somebody asking me in the comments already, the Real Forno, can you prove it? Hi. That's, I don't know. That's about all I got. But welcome. We're going to keep this kind of abbreviated. I am under the weather pretty bad. And quite frankly, there is nothing to talk about other than the same rehash topic. So we're going to rehash one that we've dived into a little bit here and there, but I think salary cap deserves a conversation, a long form conversation, meaning that conversation is more than just, oh, the Vikings have this much, let's go spend it. It's more complicated than that. So the hypothesis here is answering the question, is having a lot of salary cap space a good thing? It's not quite simple to answer that question. Now, if you have holes to fill and you have players you want to fill those holes with, having cap space is great. Having cap space to be flexible rocks. But having a lot of cap space usually necessitates having a lot of holes to fill and having major issues with your roster construction or ones where you're trying to fill. So when you have a rebuilding team, you're going to have a lot of cap space at a certain point in your rebuild, and you're going to have a lot of holes to fill on the roster. Now, the more complete teams in the NFL are not going to have a lot of holes, and they're not going to have a lot of cap space.
Take the Patriots for an example. They have a ton of cap space available to them this year and next. Why?
Yep.
Because they don't have a whole lot of good players on their team that they're paying right now. They're in a rebuild mode. They're going to have to draft and find some in free agency to get up to that point.
Absolutely. So it's never quite as simple as, oh, I love having cap space. And we're going to kind of talk about the ins and outs. So the Vikings do have a lot of cap space, but they also have significant holes on their roster to fill. Mainly defensive line. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Defensive line. Fill the holes on defensive line. And it's also about fortifying other positions by keeping guys. And I think that plays into the conversation as well, because after this year, guys like Byron Murphy Jr., Cam Bynum, they're free agents. They can go wherever they want. And because they're free agents, that provides you another variable when it comes to salary cap space. Do you keep them, and for how much? And if you keep them, that's going to significantly eat at your salary cap space, which is fine, but that's why it's there. It's there to pay players. So the idea of having a lot of cap space theoretically is great, but ideally you really don't want to be in a situation where you have a ton of cap space. You want to be able to keep some flexibility, but you also want to have enough talent on your roster where you don't need to have that excess cap space in order to go attack it. And I think that's where the conversation really gets layered and more in depth, and talking about salary cap space as a whole. You ideally, you'd want to go into every offseason about with what the Vikings had last year on $35 million in cap space, which was about 15% of the cap, gives you flexibility to go attack needs, gives you flexibility to go bring in new talent or re-sign old talent. And you're not in a position where you have to completely overhaul. And I think that's the important thing. You don't want to overhaul your roster. You don't want to overhaul what's going on, because an overhaul is not necessarily a good thing, especially considering where the Vikings are sitting right now. You don't want to overhaul this roster. You have a pretty good roster. It's got some glaring holes that you have to figure out. You have to figure out cornerback, which my personal philosophy on corner right now, they're going to figure it out with the guys in the room. They're going to be 3 guys that step up, solidify themselves in their roles, and that room's going to be fine. You have to figure out defensive line. The Vikings chose to prioritize quarterback and edge rusher this past draft. And by doing so, they made it abundantly easier to specifically attack other positions next offseason, which we talked about last week. We talked about going after the defensive tackle class. We talked about going after the running back class, both of which look very strong going into the 2024 season. That's objectively great roster management, but it also stinks because you have to really fill those holes, and filling defensive tackle is a major priority for the Minnesota Vikings moving forward. Will they be able to even get those guys? They tried to get Christian Wilkins. It didn't work. And because it didn't work, well, now you have to try and get next year's Christian Wilkins or next year's one of the top guys. What if they don't want to come here? What if they have a better offer for whatever reason somewhere else? What if they just don't want to be in the state of Minnesota? That's an element that nobody talks about enough, because you have to want to come here. It's not just about playing for the team, playing for the organization. You have to want to live in the state, which, let's be honest, the weather sucks a decent amount of the time. So there are a lot of variables that you have to factor in and consider when having a lot of these conversations. So overall, having a lot of cap space is a very big mixed bag. Where the Vikings sit, I think they're one of the healthier teams that's going to have a lot of cap space in recent memory, because they have their edge room pretty much set in stone for the next few years. They have really good offensive weapons. They have their quarterback of the future. They have their bookend tackles at least through 2025, likely longer once Christian Darrisaw signs that extension that I believe is going to come here. I would probably say next offseason, but I think he's going to stay long term. And you also have a really talented safety room. You have good linebackers now, surprisingly, after dealing with a couple years where they were really rough, and a bunch of corners who are talented. Like, there's a lot to work with when it comes to this roster, but having a ton of cap space is good in this context. But as Dave mentioned earlier, if you're the New England Patriots, just having a lot of cap space doesn't necessarily mean much. It's how you utilize it. And the best way to utilize it is to pay incumbent talent. Extend guys. By extending guys, it allows you to manipulate and play with the salary cap numbers a lot easier than bringing in an outside free agent, especially if the Vikings were able to get a deal with Christian Darrisaw done now. Because if they were able to get a deal with Darrisaw done now, they would be able to manipulate money for an extra year, which is a net positive for the Vikings. And then you can add like a void year or two. And those void years can make a huge impact on how you want to structure things. So I think there's a lot of benefit here for this rendition of the Vikings to have a lot of cap space. But it's not always a good thing. And I think that has not been mentioned nearly enough, Dave. Having cap space as a general construct does not mean good things all the time.
Well, and I said in the original remark prior to the show, I think there's a happy middle.
Yeah.
If you have too much, you don't have enough good players on your team, and you suck. If you don't have enough cap space or over, you can't get quality players to make your team good. You're shopping in the bargain bin, the $5 bin for DVDs, right? And they're all crappy movies. Well, the same thing applies to free agents in the NFL. And the guys that are still out there, haven't got a job yet, are the bottom of the bottom. So that happens. Now, we're getting a lot of talk in the chat about interior O-line, and guys, you're after my heart. You know I want that built up. And yes, cap space gives you options. Now, we talked about this year going into free agency, and there were some guards available. I looked at them. There was nothing super spectacular about the class, and there's not going to be anything looking at next year's that's real spectacular either. You might get one or two. And I think that part of that, I think, is the quality of offensive line play, especially on the interior, that exists in the NFL. There's only really a handful, a dozen, that are really, really good. And once a team has those, they lock them up, right? Like we plan on doing, hopefully the Vikings do with Christian Darrisaw. They hope to plan on locking him up.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to be able to find, and you've got to be able to get to at least mediocre to win football games. Because if you're in the bottom, very, very bottom, you're going to lose. They're going to cause you problems. If you're at the very, very top, you're going to kick ass. But if you can get at least in the middle, you're going to be winning games. Hey, I would love for us to go out next year and get the best free agent available to stick out on that O-line. If any of the interior three, whether it be Brandel, whether it be Ingram, whether it be Bradbury, fail to live up to what we want them to be as Vikings fans. But we got to look at it. Now, most of the money right now, and even more next year, goes to the offensive side of the ball. We can't neglect the defense either. So we all got to look at it. You got to play both sides. And it's a fun game for us fans to watch, but I'm sure it's pulling Quasi's hair out, and Brez has probably got migraines over, well, can we do this? Can we do that? How will this work? How does this look next year? The year after that. And it's all fun. But yes, I want strong lines, both sides. And I think that will be a target next year. Like I said, I think there's a plan. The plan's coming together. And this year's target was quarterback, draft an edge as your best picks. What will it be next year? I don't know. But I've said I think they fill in the last remaining holes next year with free agency and the draft again.
Yeah. I do want to answer a question here from the chat, or a comment from the chat. I need to. Selling McCarthyism said the Vikings had nearly $100 million after 2017. After the 2017 season, the Vikings had $42.7 million. They had enough to sign Kirk Cousins, and then they got Sheldon Richardson, and I think they did a couple other minor deals, but they didn't have $100 million. I think only a couple teams in history have ever had $100 million in cap space. But look, I mean, 42.7 was a lot then. That was
slightly cap was a lot lower then.
Slightly under 25% of the salary cap. So Rick Spielman had done a great job of drafting talent, having young talent in the building to get you that 13-3 record. And on top of that, then when he did extend guys, it was a lot easier to pay them from then on. And then you have the albatross, the Kirk Cousins contract, that made things a little more difficult. But that's a discussion that we've had over and over and over again. But let's kind of talk about the general health of the salary cap here. And we know that the salary cap on its own is this, that, or the other thing. It's kind of a mixed bag. And right now, the cap space the Vikings have is $26.2 million. That effective cap space. So after you factor in the McCarthy and Dallas Turner signings, the two additional players added on for the 53, because right now it's just counted as the top 51. And then you have to factor in how much the practice squad and in-season signings will impact it. I'm projecting that their effective cap space is $15 million after all that is said and done. Meaning $15 million can carry over into next season. $15 million can be added to next year's cap. So Right now, their projected cap space, and I think this is important to mention for over the cap, and this is not a slight. They just haven't updated their projections yet. Right now, it's at $54.52 million. But their projected salary cap for 2025 is at $260 million, which would only be a $5.6 million increase. So they have not updated the projections there, which is fine. It's June the year before that they will get those projections updated. Okay. So we have to make our own modifications. So I did my own modifications. I did my own projections. I'm going to project that the cap goes up $35 million next year. And we're going to project the cap space with that rollover money, $84 million. Sorry, that's not including the rollover money. So that would be $99 million with the rollover money. That gives you a lot to play with, but it also leaves a lot of unanswered questions. If you extend Cam Bynum, Byron Murphy Jr., Christian Darrisaw, Harrison Phillips, and let's go Aaron Jones too. That can easily be $30 to $40 million of your cap space. The one good thing about Darrisaw is you can easily lower his number because his number currently includes, I think it's like $16.9 million on next year's cap. So you could drop that to like 7 and add on another $9 million, which is fine. You can do that.
Yeah, the 16.9 is the 5th-year option.
It also gives you an opportunity if you want to just, hey, you know what? Let's just front load the contract. Let's get a little bit. But the one good thing about cap space and why people don't do that a lot is because it's essentially an interest-free loan where the cap's going up so much over time, you can kind of mess with things and keep things in context. So it's a wild world that the Vikings are going to be living in over the course of the next few years.
Selling McCarthyism, that's what they have right now because they figure only a little over $5 million in an increase in cap. We think that it's going to go up a little bit more than that, a lot more. We'll find out though.
If the Vikings end up keeping the $15 million that I have their effective cap space at, which is plausible, it'll probably be closer to 10. So if it's at 10 million, $94 million in projected cap space. That's a lot of money, but there are a lot of variables that could change that over the course of then and now. So it's important to understand that you have to potentially navigate the re-signings of a bunch of players, which could easily be like $20 to $40 million. And then you're going to go in the offseason trying to bring in guys. And who knows, maybe you're going to strike a trade where you're going to get a talented defensive player. And there's so many little nuances that I'm very intrigued by from a long-term perspective, but we're just going to have to find out. And I think that salary cap health is going to be really interesting to follow over the course of the next few months because of how Kwesi Adofo-Mensah chooses to handle it. Because it's all about flexibility. Well, some of these free agent contracts, it's harder to bake in that kind of flexibility that Kwesi Adofo-Mensah wants. It's a lot easier with a guy in-house to be able to kind of maneuver with that and do it. But an outside hire makes it tougher. Jonathan Grenard, first year, good, like most free agent deals. Second, third, and fourth years, pretty ironclad, pretty tight-knit. Now, you can obviously adjust. You can restructure and give a guy a bunch of his base salary and signing bonus and move it out in future years. You can obviously do that stuff. But it's better to be able to have that flexibility right away rather than have to go that route. So I'm intrigued to see how Kwesi handles it. But the Vikings salary cap health is pretty good, but they have to hit and they have to be able to re-sign the players that they have. They have to be able to do this, that, and the other thing. And I think that element is going to be really intriguing to see how the Minnesota Vikings are going to be able to navigate this next era, this next piece of the competitive rebuild, because that's the most important thing. They have to hit this part because they have the young guys. They have a lot of raw talent. They have guys at premium positions on good deals. Jordan Addison, rookie contract. Dallas Turner, JJ McCarthy, rookie contracts. Valuable assets. Not just good football players, hopefully, but valuable assets. And then you have TJ Hawkinson and Justin Jefferson on pretty much market level deals, which nobody's going to complain about that because they're more than worth it. Excuse me. But that's kind of the crux of it. It's not just about having cap space and like, oh, like we don't want to give up this cap space. Well, you have to use cap space to sign guys, but you have to sign the right guys. And that's the key. It's okay to give a guy a ton of money, even if you're losing some cap space. That's why cap space is there. You got to pay guys. And I'm going to be really intrigued to see how the Minnesota Vikings are going to attack things this next offseason, because there's little elements here and there that are just intriguing. And I don't have the answers yet on how Kwesi is going to use this kind of cap space, because he had good cap space this year. He attacked edge rusher vehemently. He got a quality linebacker that can be versatile for Brian Flores. And he got the running back that Kevin O'Connell really, really needed. Well, now he's going to have a bigger check to play with. How is that going to manifest itself? I can't wait. I really can't wait. I think it's going to be an excellent, excellent thing to watch for.
Yeah, I do too. And you got to remember this year, of all our cap space, over 57 million of it is going to players that are no longer on the team. Next year, it's only $3,000, well over $3,000 going to dead cap. So we'll be able to better
million.
Huh? It may be 3 million next year. I thought it was 3,000, but it could be 3 million. But either way, more of the money in the cap will be spent on actual players and better quality players than what we've had to date under Kwesi and KOC.
For context, Dave mentioned the dead cap, $57.39 million this year in dead cap. That's Kirk Cousins, 28.5, Danielle Hunter, 14.9, Marcus Davenport, 6.8. And then Dalvin Cook, Dean Lowry, Alexander Madison, and Nesezi Odomewo have varying amounts. 2025's dead cap, it is 3,000. That must have come from cutting a UDFA. I think that must have came from Devron Harper or Matt Cindric when they cut them, and then their signing bonus money comes off next year. But yeah. Ooh, Gary. All right. Well, we're pretty much done talking about the salary cap. So let's talk about food. Gary's favorite topic here on this show says it's Monday, pizza night. Tonight is corn crust, smoke pulled St. Louis rib meat with a few pickles and onions, mushrooms, and hot jalapenos. Barbecue sauce based smoked Gouda topped with coleslaw. Gary, my man, that is an insane pizza. I don't mean that as crazy. It's got a lot going on. You got to tell us about it. So, is it a cornmeal crust? I'm guessing that's where you're going with it, which makes sense for barbecue. Let's just be real. That's a lot of ingredients. Does it get overwhelming as far as the flavor profiles trying to like overpower each other? Does it blend well? I want to hear more about this because that's an interesting pizza. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm very intrigued. And that's interesting.
It is. I agree. Gary's making me hungry.
Yep. I will tell you the other day, Dave, last Sunday, I made smoked salsa for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I took everything that you would just use for salsa, your tomatoes, your peppers, your onion, and I quartered them, drizzled a little olive oil, seasoned them, threw them in the smoker for 225 for 90 minutes, and then blended it with a food processor, and then I cooled it, and I made a smoked salsa.
Sounds good.
All right. Gary has reported back. It is perfect for at least all that he's served it to. That's good to know, because sometimes some of those barbecue flavors can not necessarily overpower everything, but some of them aren't as bright as they maybe you would like them to be. So it's always good to talk to somebody who's made it before you give it a try, so you kind of understand what you're getting into. I might pitch that to my wife, like a version of that, because that's very interesting. I did make ribs the other week. Oh,
I made them last week too.
St. Louis style ribs. The meats, I like the meat better, but they're such a pain in the butt. They are a big pain in the butt. But man, do I enjoy them. Oh, yes.
But overall, getting back to the cap, I think the Vikings are in a good spot right now. There's nobody to go out and get as of now. Not that I've seen anywhere that's worth spending money on. Next year, we'll watch who comes off on those key spots, defensive line, offensive line. If there's any other spot that we absolutely have to have, and I can't really think of any. Most of the other ones are pretty good, pretty well off. You know, maybe a corner. But we're doing pretty good, and the progress over the 3 years to get this far, to get to where we are next year, is pretty good, and I look forward to it. I think the Vikings are on the right track. I think they had a plan when they got hired. I think they're working the plan, and the plan is working. So just keep it going.
Yeah. I think the plan is working, but I also think it's just important to understand the full scope of the salary cap. Understand that having cap space isn't necessarily a good thing, because it tells you more about your roster. Brian, to finish up, said the trade deadline moved this season. Yes, I believe the trade deadline was moved to instead of right after week 8, right after week 10, giving teams more of
following the week 9 games. I just looked it up.
So they moved it back a week, and the theory being that it gives teams a little bit more time to determine, hey, do we need to be buyers? Do we need to be sellers? What are we going to do? If the Vikings ended up having that week, maybe they do end up trading Danielle Hunter. But because Kirk Cousins got hurt 2 days before the deadline, it made things a little bit more rushed. And that, it's not necessarily a bad or a wrong thing. It's just kind of what the reality of the situation was. So now that we're looking at how things project moving forward, having the trade deadline later is a good thing for all parties.
Well, I think it was Brian earlier said maybe that's the time to trade Darnold, if JJ McCarthy's ready.
It all depends on
and what we could get for him. Yeah,
and
somebody loses their quarterback.
This way, if JJ McCarthy's ready and Darnold's not playing well, it's not going to matter. You're not going to get anything worth value for him. If Darnold is playing well and McCarthy's ready, they may just ride out with Darnold because they're going to be very cautious about McCarthy's upbringing. And that's not to say, like, if McCarthy's ready in week 4 and Darnold is having a 1998 Randall Cunningham year, McCarthy might not see the field. And there's nothing wrong with that.
It would have to be a perfect situation where some team just lost their starting quarterback and thought Darnold would be better and willing to pay the Vikings a boatload to get him.
If you can exploit a team, absolutely exploit them. Get some draft capital back. But we'll kind of see how things play out. My assumption is Sam Darnold will walk. The Vikings will be eligible for a comp pick of some kind, but they probably won't get it because they're going to sign enough free agents. That's my theory. The Vikings aren't going to have a ton of good free agents leave this year like they did last year. We'll find out. But guys, that's going to be the end of the show tonight. A little bit abbreviated. I'm dealing with a pretty rough stomach bug, and quite frankly, it's June and there's nothing to talk about. So we'll keep it abbreviated,
break, baby.
Yeah, but we're going to have
Jefferson more in France starting his stuff.
Good for
a fashion show.
We'll have some more food conversations. Gary, keep bringing the heat. We're going to have some fun with that. In the meantime, thank you guys very much for listening. Like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell on YouTube to get those notifications so you know when we go live. And if you're on the podcast, 5-star reviews. Again, write us a good review. We'll read it on the show. Until then, I'm Tyler. He's Dave. As always, SKOL Vikings.
SKOL Vikings. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell to get notifications. It helps us grow this community that we all love our Minnesota Vikings. And on behalf of Tyler Forness and myself, Dave Stefano, thank you so dearly for watching The Real Forno Show. SKOL, everyone!